Hey everyone, and welcome to Chrontendo, episode 63. You know, when I first started this series, I told you guys up front that this was not going to be a rose garden. This is not going to be a walk in the park, and today's episode is definitely an example of that. We have some mind-bogglingly terrible games today, as well as a couple that are sort of okay, almost, and then some that are just plain blah. One game in particular, I'm sure, resulted in countless disappointed kids on Christmas Day, one of the most notorious releases for the NES. This episode will cover the end of June, and we'll take a look at the early releases for the month of July. And there are actually 11 games this episode because I did a bit of a boo-boo a couple episodes ago, so I'm having to catch up. Hey, sometimes mistakes happen. Alright, so let's get started. Okay, so we now have Night Move, developed by Alexei Pajitnov. And as I mentioned, there is going to be a bonus game this episode, and it's actually this game right here. Thanks to an eagle-eyed patron for pointing out this is a game that I had missed. I actually did have it on my Chrontendo list, but accidentally colored it in red, which means if you've ever seen my official list, that is used for a game that's already been covered in a different format or something like that. And even though the FDS was mostly dead by 1990, there were still quite a few reissues of old NES games that were coming out at this time, but not a whole lot of original games. So this is a rather odd chess-based game, and the reason it's called Night Move is because you control the knight piece, and you have to move in the L-shaped pattern that knights in chess must adhere to. And there are a couple of gameplay options. The B-type is actually a little bit harder than the regular version. You also have a few music tracks you can choose from. So the idea here is that you have sort of like a very small chessboard with a heart on one of the squares. The objective here is to land on the square with the heart. And of course, the only way that you can move is in that distinctive L-shaped pattern that the knight can move in an actual game of chess. As you can see, the game starts off pretty slowly. Every time you clear one of the screens, a new maze will appear and the game speeds up slightly. There are a few hazards here, namely that if you land on the same square in a single round, a certain number of times, that tile will disappear. And if you then accidentally land on that empty tile again, you will lose a life. Now, as you can imagine, the controls are a bit odd. Your knight does not move vertically or horizontally, but rather diagonally. So it might make more sense to hold the D-pad rotated 45 degrees so that the D-pad buttons are oriented in a diagonal direction. The second mode, or the B mode, here is a little bit trickier. In this case, you have to complete the puzzle within a certain number of moves. The heart will show you the number of moves that you have left. If you fail to land on the heart within the allotted number of moves, then you get a game over. Now, normally this would be the end of our story, however, it does have a rather little odd epilogue, but Pajitnov must have liked the idea behind this game because he released a second game titled Night Moves, not Night Move, but rather Night Moves, with an extra S on the end, and this was released in 1995, published by Spectrum Holobyte. Now, of course, the graphics have gotten a bit fancier within that 5-year time period, and we now have an actual knight wearing a suit of armor jumping around from square to square in this game. This seems to be mostly forgotten, but is still playable on the current version of Windows using good old compatibility mode. You can actually get this thing up and running. But as for the Famicom Disk System Night Move, it's a cute little game, but really, that's all there is to it. Alright, kids, we're going to wrap up June of 1990 this episode. And the first game today is Golgo 13-2, or as it's known in the US, the Mafat Conspiracy. And this is one of those rare Japanese games that was released in the US before Japan. The US release was in June of 1990, and the Japanese release was in July. This was published by the telecommunications company Victokai. Some of you might remember the original Golgo 13 game, which came out some time ago, but I suspect the majority of you will probably not remember a single damn thing about that game. And as far as I can tell, both these games are pretty similar. So, to jog your memory, Golgo 13 was a long-running comic book that began in the 1960s and was published up until a couple years ago, I think. It's about a professional assassin who goes by the name of Duke Togo. And so always is a little bit funny to me because we used to have I guess we still do have a small Subway sandwich chain in Northern California called Togo's. It was pretty popular for a while before being pretty much, everything was taken over by Subway. Anyway, as you can imagine, this game involves basically him just shooting a bunch of people. Now we do get some pretty decent Ninja Gaiden style cutscenes here, where you basically get the whole plot laid out. Something about the Strategic Defense Initiative satellites getting shot down, or something, I really don't know. So there is some kind of plot here, but from what I played, it's mostly just walking around shooting people and getting lost in mazes. Now, once you actually start the game itself, you'll find yourself walking down the street, and, for a guy who's like a top-tier assassin, he somehow forgot to bring his gun with him, so you have to kick and punch all these guys. Once you are done navigating the dangerous streets of Paris, I believe, I think this takes place in Paris, you'll meet a guy who finally gives you a damn gun. And of course, this doesn't really come with a huge supply of bullets. Regardless, you do have the option to just duck and shoot guys rather than trying to duck and then jumping up and kicking them. You'll get attacked by guys from both the front and the back. One of the more irritating things about this section is that the enemies will just sort of materialize right behind you and then shoot you immediately. The fact that your character's sprite is so large and pretty damn slow actually makes the whole thing not really suitable for this kind of action game. It's actually pretty hard to avoid getting shot a lot. And once again, you'll travel a few blocks down the road, then you'll encounter another cutscene. This lady gives you some more instructions about your mission, and now you gotta go to a different place, yada yada yada. Now, if you remember the first Golgo 13 game, you might remember that one of the more annoying things about it was the first-person mazes. And guess what? The mazes are back. The developers of this game must have just absolutely loved mazes because there's a bunch of mazes in this game, and every single one is pretty much just a series of blank, featureless walls. And it is an absolute pain in the ass to make your way through these mazes. The actual developer of Golgo 13, the Mafat Conspiracy, is Capcom. We've seen several Capcom games throughout Chrontendo, though you probably will not be able to remember any of them. I certainly can't. Looking through their CV, we have such classics as Flying Hero, Hoops, and Amagon. Absolutely none of these ring a bell for me. Maybe their most well-known game for the NES is Vice Project Doom, which will be coming up at some point in the near future. So, like I was saying, we have mazes. This maze just goes on and on and on, and the fact that there's almost no sort of like distinguishing landmarks anywhere in this maze, with a few exceptions, like there's a flight of stairs, it's gonna be pretty difficult to figure out where you are. And believe me, I spent a lot of time wandering around in this maze before finally realizing that I was just like never gonna find my way out. I tried to look up a map online, still couldn't find a way out, so basically this is as far as I got in the game. I wouldn't say this is the worst game this episode. I mean, I certainly don't like it, but at least it feels like it's, I guess, trying to look cool? I don't know. I think with these Golgo 13 games, if you just took out all the goddamn mazes, this might not be half bad. I mentioned there are going to be some pretty terrible games this episode, and well, this is definitely one of them right here. An absolute bug shit of a video game from Capcom. Adventures in Disney's Magic Kingdom. Certainly the worst Disney game released by Capcom for the NES. I guess the concept here is that this must have been a game aimed at a much younger audience than normal, though it's not necessarily easier than games like Chip and Dale. It's just mostly really monotonous. This is perhaps the only Capcom Disney game that might be categorized as Kosoge. Okay, so the plot here is that Mickey, Goofy, and Donald have lost the keys that they need to open up the castle where all the Main Street Parade stuff is kept in, I guess. And these imbeciles can't do anything for themselves, so it's up to you to wander around Disneyland and collect the necessary keys. There's a total of 6 keys to collect, and 5 of them are found inside various Disneyland rides. The 6th key has to be collected in a different fashion, as we'll see later. Alright, so you sort of need to wander around the theme park until you find some attractions that you can actually enter. There's quite a few number of buildings that you'll encounter, but most of those cannot actually be entered. So you do need to enter 6 specific buildings in order to find those keys. So we're going to start by going into Space Mountain. The Space Mountain portion of the game doesn't really resemble the actual Space Mountain ride at all. What you do here is you essentially have like a little spaceship and you're driving around through space and you need to avoid asteroids and alien spaceships. For some reason the game incorrectly refers to the asteroids as meteors. The instructions say to press A or B to avoid the meteors, which are, as you know, different than asteroids. But what you're supposed to do here is sort of look at the screen, and there'll be like an arrow that appears to let you know which way you need to swerve to avoid hitting the quote-unquote meteor. It's sort of like a Simon Says reflexes game, I guess. And you also encounter these things which are apparently supposed to be spaceships, though they look kind of like a giant stone head. You need to shoot those. This game gets relatively difficult towards the end. Everything speeds up as you make progress through the level, and you'll have to be pretty damn quick on the draw in order to get through this thing. For the most part, it's simply dumb, boring, and a pain in the ass. Once you reach the end of the ride, you'll receive from Mickey a silver key, which brings up a pretty big question: is why does Mickey need you to find the key when he has it in his actual possession right here? Now, while you're wandering around the park, you might occasionally run into some kids who ask you Disney-related trivia questions. If you answer the trivia questions correctly, the kid will trust you, and he'll let you know the location of where he last saw one of the keys. And you actually have to go around asking quite a few kids about the key before you'll finally get it. Autopia is pretty close, so I guess we'll check out there next. Now, even though this game is aimed at little kids, it can be a bit brutal in places. Autopia is kind of like a standard little auto race game, but you have to perform pretty much perfectly in order to get to the end of this race and come in first place. Some of the levels have like hidden timers, so often you'll find yourself driving and then you start slowing down simply because you did not hit the invisible checkpoint in enough time. Thunder Mountain is actually pretty similar to Autopia, except this time you're driving a train across a series of tracks trying to get to the station at the end of the ride. There's really no other vehicles to crash into, but there are a lot of turns and forks throughout the level, and you sort of have to pick the shortest path in order to avoid running out of time. Now, I had a hell of a time with this one, and it seems like I always lost even when I brought the train in on time, until I eventually noticed at the very beginning of the ride, Mickey will tell you that you have to bring the train in to a specific station in order to actually complete the course. And the station number isn't visible at all when you start the course, so you can pretty much completely screw yourself if you just happen to choose the wrong course from the get-go. Anyway, I kept going into the wrong station instead of station 4, and once I figured it out, it was definitely quite a bit easier. This is definitely not a bad looking level. It looks pretty cool with dinosaur skeletons and stuff, but there's really not much to do here other than to navigate the train down these tracks. Okay, so we're more than halfway through here, but we still have the 2 longest levels to complete. Let's start with Haunted Mansion. So the thing about this is, aside from, running into enemies and falling down bottomless pits and that kind of thing, there is also, once again, an invisible timer going on throughout the level. So if you don't move through this thing quickly enough, you'll basically just suddenly, in the middle of nowhere, just die and get a game over. And again, you cannot see the timer, and you have no idea how long the timer is. And of course, the timer resets as you progress through the level, so you basically just sort of have to be constantly moving during the Haunted Mansion level. And quite frankly, this level would be kind of cool if it wasn't for the damn timer. There's a sort of little ghost boss at the very end that you have to attack with a meat cleaver, I believe, which doesn't really sound very effective against a ghost. But once you land the final cleaver chop on this guy, you will be instantly transported to the screen where you're told you have another key. It's just blam, he's dead, the level's over. The whole thing has kind of an almost unfinished feel to it. I mean, the levels in theory aren't necessarily bad, it just feels like this was completed in a relatively short time period and it didn't really have a whole lot of polish. Alright, so the biggest level I have saved for last, the Pirates of the Caribbean. This one is kind of similar to the Haunted Mansion in the sense that rather than a racing game, it's sort of like a platforming level. And just like the Haunted Mansion, there is an invisible timer that runs constantly through the level, and you will drop dead instantly if that timer, which you can't see, ever runs out. And I kind of think the idea behind this was that, this is a game made for a younger audience, and, you know what it was like back in the day when you were, playing Nintendo back with your, little sister or cousin or something like that. And when it was their turn, they would just like screw around forever, taking their sweet time. So I think the whole timer thing was put in just to kind of like counteract that. So you can't just like spend like an hour wandering around the haunted mansion. You actually have to try to make some progress. Or at least, this is my theory. So the Pirates of the Caribbean level is probably the closest this comes to like an actual normal video game level that you might enjoy playing. It's a cute little platformer with a bit of exploration involved. It's also, like as I mentioned, the longest level in the game. You have to avoid the pirates, rescue a few maidens, you get to take a little trip on a boat while watching out for cannonballs. I mean, this is certainly not Mega Man level Capcom happening here, and the fact that you have to search around the level looking for maidens to rescue is not a whole lot of fun simply because of that damn timer. And some of the jumps here have to be pretty precise. I mean, this is a kiddie game, but it's actually pretty difficult in certain parts that require some very accurate timing. So at this point you will have collected all the keys with the exception of the last one. Now you just need to keep walking around the park until you accidentally encounter some dumb looking kids. Apparently there's a dog, maybe Pluto, wandering around who has the final key. If he asks the kid where Pluto went, he'll get a little suspicious and determined that if you're truly a friend of Mickey Mouse, you would be an expert in Disney trivia. He'll always ask you some dumb question, and if you get it right, then he'll point you into the general direction of where the dog was last seen. Then of course you meet up with another kid doing the same thing until you finally meet up with Pluto. Now, quite frankly, a lot of these trivia questions would not be known by normal young kids back then. Some reference like well-known Disney movies, and others are just totally obscure. Now, the game does give you a question about one of the most little-known pieces of Disney trivia, namely Donald Duck's middle name. Believe it or not, Donald Duck's middle name only appeared once, very briefly, in a single cartoon, 1942's Donald Gets Drafted. His middle name is Fauntleroy, by the way, and that is something that would have only been known by the most obsessive Disney aficionados. In the pre-internet age, virtually no one would be able to answer this question other than by, utterly impossible dumb luck. Okay, so once you've answered all these damn trivia questions, you'll eventually be given the damn key, so now we can march down to the princess's castle. I think this might be Sleeping Beauty's castle, I'm not sure, and we can finally just open the damn door and start the parade. So just everything about this game just seems weird, from the very concept of Mickey Mouse needing keys in order to march in a parade, to the rather annoying mini-games and trivia quizzes. On the face of it, a game about running around Disneyland and going through different levels based on the rides seems like a pretty good idea, but the execution on this is definitely lacking a lot. It feels like a kiddie game, but it can be surprisingly difficult at times. Capcom did, of course, produce a number of really great Disney games for the NES and for the Super Nintendo, but this game is definitely not one of them. Okay, next up is Solstice, one of those weird isometric games that were so popular in England in the 1980s. And this thing actually had a release in both the US and Japan, unlike most of those types of games. This was first released in the US in June, and then released in Japan in July. This was developed by Software Creations, a British game developer whose titles included the infamous Silver Surfer game for the NES. Now, despite this, Solstice was pretty well received, despite being in this type of style, the same as like Saberwolf and that sort of game. It's a game where you basically spend all your time walking around a bunch of rooms in isometric perspective. Now, I will admit this does have a pretty cool opening cutscene. In the typical video game fashion, the princess is captured by an evil wizard of some sort. And the music is by Tim Follin, which, as expected, is pretty good, what there is of it. One weird thing is that your wizard is wearing relatively little clothing on the box art, while in the game he's covered from head to toe by his hat and cloak. And then there's this promotional image, which goes all out. There's a real vibe here of, hey, here's the wizard ad. Real sexy, just like you wanted it. So as I mentioned, this is just one of those standard British isometric games where you simply move from one room to the other. There's a total of 250 rooms in this game, though you don't actually need to go through all the rooms. You can beat the game by going through approximately 70% of them. Each room will have various obstacles that you'll need to find a way around. In this room, for example, you have two monsters or trolls or something that will kill you if you touch them. You sort of need to navigate around them and get from one door to the other. This is one of the very first rooms, so it's relatively simple. You have a very limited jump, and touching even one enemy will cause instant death. On the other hand, you can also carry certain items which you can find throughout the game. For the most part, the enemies don't really attack you directly. Often they just sort of walk around in some sort of predetermined or perhaps random pattern. So the object here is really mostly to avoid enemies rather than fighting them. And the mechanics in this game are actually quite finicky, so you have to be very precise when you jump. It's really quite easy to accidentally fall off a stair or a platform. If you kind of like mess up the room somehow, you can simply exit and then come back in and it'll be completely reset. Some of the levels do require a lot of precision when it comes to controlling your character. Like, you often have to be within like 1 pixel when it comes to making jumps or avoiding obstacles. As I mentioned earlier, you do have to pick up a number of items. There's a sort of a vaguely Metroid-ish feel to this game, in the way that you often have to find a specific power-up in order to get through a later part of the maze. Here, for example, you need to grab those green boots, which allow you to jump higher. This requires you to jump onto a set of platforms, then actually jumping on the enemy's head. And for some reason in this game, touching enemies by landing on them doesn't harm you. And then once you get over to the area in the upper left, you can jump off his head and land on that little platform near the green boots. You actually land on that little treadmill. Now the thing is, the treadmill is actually approximately 1 unit too high for you to jump onto, so you have to take that blue cube and then push it onto the enemy's head so that you're high enough to actually jump onto that little treadmill. And this is pretty indicative of the types of puzzles in this game. What makes this game so annoying is simply that when it comes to pushing that block onto the head and landing on the block, the timing is, again, extremely finicky. I mean, you must be very precise. And I think that anyone trying to play this game, and if they sort of like, as they say nowadays, bounces off of it, it's going to be because of the extremely precise timing required to do pretty much everything in this game. A few other things that you might not like, just because of the way this game uses isometric perspective, most of the screen is going to be taken up by purely black empty space. At any given time, the actual percentage of the screen that's taken up with any graphics is going to be less than 50%. As I mentioned, this did get pretty good reviews, and they had a sequel a little bit later, and a lot of people do seem to like it. I mean, I guess you certainly get your money's worth. It's going to take a while to get all the way through this damn thing. It's definitely not my favorite game this episode, and I mean, if you like this kind of thing, by all means go ahead and dig in, but I myself could never even imagine coming close to finishing this game simply because of the very high annoyance factor. Okay, so we've got some pretty terrible games this episode. In fact, most of the games here are pretty terrible, but I don't know that anything else reaches the level of The Last Starfighter in terms of being just a total ripoff. I'm sure any kid who got this for Christmas was bitterly disappointed when they actually played the game, and you will see why once we start up here. If you have not played The Last Starfighter before, let me tell you, I guess this video is going to be a bit of a treat. This is a frontrunner for the worst shoot 'em up on the NES so far. First of all, let me just point out this game has like 15 seconds of music in it. And in fact, there's no music whatsoever in the actual levels themselves. I mean, when was the last time we saw an NES game in this series with like literally no music during the game? It certainly was not common by 1990. So as you can see here, you fly around in this rather silly looking little spaceship. Various generic enemies will come out rushing at you either from the left or the right. They shoot at you, sometimes they hit you, sometimes they don't, sometimes they just fly harmlessly, over you. Doesn't make much sense. Yeah, so this game has kind of like a weird perspective where it's like a horizontal shooter, but the angle that you're looking at it from is like from the top, so you're looking down. It's a bit weird. Each of the levels is almost exactly the same and consist of some rather long spaceships which you need to destroy while you're dodging all these little like mini fleets of enemy spaceships. The controls are a bit different than you might think. Pressing left or right will actually cause you to slow down, and then if you keep holding down on the left or right button, whichever you're facing, it will eventually stop your ship completely, then turn around so you can start flying in the opposite direction. So you can't just like turn around, you have to slow down, stop, and then turn around. I guess it's kind of a slightly unintuitive control scheme for a game like this. Now, there's something in this game that you probably don't want to normally encounter when you're doing a shoot-'em-up game like this, and that's having to fly over terrain that is three-dimensional, meaning that if you look closely at the ship as you're flying, you'll see that some of the stuff, like on top of the ship, casts like a little shadow, meaning that it sticks out in terms of height, like three-dimensionally, so you can actually crash into those things. So for example, like right here. So when you're moving to the left or right throughout this game, which is quite frankly the only two directions you can really move in, you need to look very carefully at the background to make sure that you're not going to run into something. Now how you beat the level is once you've shot down, I think, a certain number of enemy planes. I'm not completely sure what actually triggers this, but you will see the words "Land Now" start flashing near the top of the screen. This means that you can now exit the level, which is done by landing your spaceship. And the weird thing is that when you land, you have to be facing towards the right-hand side of the screen. So you sort of slow down, and sometimes your craft will just sort of automatically land on the strip, and other times you'll just keep going. I really have no idea what you're supposed to be doing, other than just realize you might have to go back and forth a few times before the plane actually lands. So once you've done this, you get this weird little cutscene where like the ship is exploding or something, and it actually just sort of starts disintegrating like into a big cloud of dust on one end and just goes all the way to the other end of the ship. And you don't control your ship during this. This is purely like an unnecessarily long cutscene, I guess. As you go through the game, each level will have like more stuff sticking up for you to hit, but for the most part, other than that, every level is kind of the same. I mean, nothing really changes. And there's going to be the exact same enemies in each level. The game does not really throw anything new at you after the first level, other than just putting in more obstacles for you to hit. The Last Starfighter was developed by a British company called Gold, and they made a number of computer games back in the 80s. And so here's like the sort of dark secret of The Last Starfighter. Now you guys might be aware of the 1984 science fiction movie The Last Starfighter. It's about a kid who plays a video game at the trailer park where he lives. And it turns out these video games were placed on Earth and other planets in order to see who has like the best potential spaceship pilot skills, so that they can fight in an intergalactic war that's happening out there. And because the kid is so good at the video game, a guy comes down and says, "Hey kid, we want you to become a child soldier and kill a bunch of guys." The movie itself is actually pretty decent. And as I mentioned, it did come out in 1984, so 6 years before the video game. But here's the thing, when the kids, got this game and started playing it, their first thought would be, hey, wait a second, what does this really have anything to do with the movie The Last Starfighter? I mean, there's no mention in this game about anything that actually happened in the movie. And when you're playing this, you might be thinking that this feels like a video game that's completely unrelated to the movie, and that is actually correct. In what you might consider to be an extreme cost-cutting measure, Gold simply took an old computer game and ported it to the NES and then called it The Last Starfighter. They literally did not bother to make a new game based on the movie. They just substituted an existing game from several years ago, and that's gotta be one of the most ballsiest video game company scams of all time. So this game is simply a port of a 1986 Commodore 64 game called Iridium. And apparently they just had like literally one guy port this to the NES, and then they slapped the new name on it. Now the original Iridium game also seems to be pretty annoying to play. However, for some reason, I guess it's just like the way people's brains were wired back in the mid-80s, but this game got like a lot of critical acclaim. I mean, despite looking and playing like absolute garbage, a lot of the video game magazines at the time gave it like really fantastic reviews. According to Zap64, the game was quote-unquote visually awesome, sonically sound, technically stunning, and a brilliant shoot-'em-up to boot. British people apparently absolutely loved the original computer game for some reason. So as I mentioned, there's a total of 15 levels in this game, and the cherry on top of the whole thing is that, once you've beaten level 15, they give you like one of those like, oh, congratulations type messages. I mean, it doesn't give you like a cutscene or anything like that, but rather than the standard congratulations message, you get the stupidest possible message at the very end of the game. So here it is. Yeah, good zapping turkey. I don't even know exactly what that's supposed to mean. I've seen a lot of horrible games, but this one, I don't even really know how to describe it. And if you're like an absolute masochist, yeah, I guess give it a try. And the entire game is pretty annoying to begin with, but when you reach that final message, where you finally beat it, that's like the cherry on top. It's just like the stupidest thing they could have done when you beat the game. So moving right along, I hope that you do love horrible British shoot-'em-ups, because we have another one coming up right now. Oh man, so if you thought The Last Starfighter was going to be the only horrible British shoot-'em-up game, well, guess what? You are so wrong. Captain Skyhawk, published by Milton Bradley and developed by Rare. And you can tell this is a Rare game by the stuff like the way they make all the letters in the title screen like sort of slide down the page. That is absolutely the kind of thing that Rare just loves doing. All these graphic effects, which seems kind of cool, but has no impact on the quality of the game itself, if you know what I mean. It just feels like them kind of fooling around, I don't know. So here we go, let's just take a look at this thing. Captain Skyhawk is a pretty bare-bones shooter, which is notable for exactly one thing. Well, I guess technically two things. One is it can be pretty damned annoying, and two, it uses a background which I guess isn't technically isometric, but it does have kind of like a fake 3D feel that you might recognize from games like Zaxxon and also Solstice 2, I guess. I mean, at least it's different. There aren't a whole lot of NES games that try to do this, but this game has, I'd say, some pretty serious issues which will probably drive you crazy if you try to play it. Now, here's a hint I can give you. As soon as you take off, immediately use the D-pad to increase your altitude. There is absolutely no reason in this game to not be at the highest altitude at all times. There's really no situations where you would ever need to decrease your altitude. The only thing that does is causes you to run into things like mountains. You know, this kind of reminds me a little bit of the Last Starfighter in the sense that you're sort of moving, relatively quickly through certain levels in this game, and your main objective seems to be mostly just to avoid running into things. I mean, it seems like you can almost practically just ignore the enemies in this, and it seems much more likely that you're going to get killed by running into a mountain rather than getting shot by an enemy fighter. But of course, sometimes that will happen. Okay, so your objective here is simply to make it all the way to the end of the level, and in this case you need to destroy a little mini base. I suppose these are kind of like boss battles, but I mean, it's not like they're interesting boss battles. It's not like there's some kind of like gigantic, cool-looking monster or something like you might see in R-Type. This one right here is like a little complex or something. You need to shoot out each of those little domes until it blows up. And it doesn't even really blow up. It's just like a little hole appears every time you take one of these things out. And they do shoot back at you a little bit, but I mean, this isn't really like a boss fight that requires any sort of strategy. Once you've gotten the 4 main outer domes blown up, you can just shoot the thing in the middle and that's it. Now, I suppose that if the game had sort of, left it at this, then Skyhawk would be kind of like a dog shit yet slightly playable game. However, in the rare tradition, they felt the need to tack on some extremely annoying minigames between levels. So first of all, whenever you finish each level, there's going to be like a little minigame where you have to shoot down airplanes. I'm not sure exactly when this game is supposed to take place. I mean, it appears to be like in some kind of like sci-fi futuristic world, but for these in-between minigames, it suddenly feels like you're playing Top Gun or Afterburner. The game doesn't quite seem to be sure whether it takes place in the far-flung future or in the modern day. And there's really not much to these levels. Basically, these planes just fly past you, and you shoot them, and then you rack up points. And depending on how many you shoot, you can get like obtain like a currency in order to purchase upgrades in a store. Now, I guess this would be tolerable until we get to this little bit of business right here. So, in order to get to the store, where you upgrade your plane and your weapons and whatnot, you have to dock with the space station. Now, I don't know why they decided to turn this into a minigame, but to make it more difficult, you have to line up your plane, or whatever this is, exactly into that little slot in the middle. And keep in mind, this is done by pressing the up and down button, and it's a little bit more tricky than you might think. Because when you're pressing the button and let go, the plane will keep moving. It doesn't stop the second that you take your finger off. So basically, you just sort of take turns hitting the up and down button over and over until you just sort of happen to get it positioned exactly correctly. And aside from that, here's the really bad part, is that you can also move your plane left to right by pressing the left and right buttons. However, you absolutely do not want to do this because that will pretty much end the game for you. You really can't control the plane while you're hitting the left and right buttons in this, and you will simply go all the way to the left or all the way to the right. You can't stop in the middle and align yourself with the entrance. You will just bounce around from the far right to the far left over and over again and basically get stuck. And you might think that, well, hey, I messed up, but I'll just kill myself and then I can start again. And then the answer is no. That does not work because you decide to crash into the space station. Yeah, you will lose a life, but you will actually reappear at the exact same spot. So I can tell you that if you move to the left or the right during this space station sequence, you will never be able to go forward and you will pretty much have to reset the game. Now, at this point, once you get into the space station, after probably a number of tries, and it did get a little bit easier as I went through the game later. But you can then buy like upgraded cannons, various types of missiles, and that kind of thing. Once you leave the space station, you're going to be back down on the ground, and there's another shoot-'em-up section, which is actually pretty similar to the first. The enemies change a bit from level to level, but honestly, once you've played the first level, you've kind of played them all. And there's actually only like really 3 different types of goals. The first one is where you blow up an enemy base like we saw a minute ago. Then there's another one where you need to drop a bomb or something into like a little access port on the ground, kind of like the end of Star Wars when you blow up the Death Star. And the third one is when you get to the end of the level, you need to destroy another type of enemy base, and then you'll pick up a scientist guy afterwards. And of course, after every single one of these levels, you then do another airplane sequence, then you dock with the shuttle again, buy a few more upgrades, and so on and so forth. And in many ways, once you've played through the first level of this, you've kind of seen the entire game. Now, Captain Skyhawk does mix it up a little bit. There's a couple of fast levels where for some reason your ship is moving significantly faster than the other levels, but basically these faster levels are really just the same thing, just everything's faster. There are a few things that are kind of irritating, and one of them is that it seems like the developers really love to put in all these little particle effects, so that when you shoot things, there's like a little explosion and pieces of debris go all over the place. And you might think that if these hit you, it'll damage your ship, but no, you can actually just go right through this stuff. It doesn't hurt you at all. What you actually need to watch out for are these little gray diamond-shaped things that are the actual enemy projectiles, and sometimes they can be a bit hard to see because they tend to blend into the background. I mean, definitely they're harder to see than those harmless projectiles, which are quite clear. And for me at least, I mean, 9 times out of 10 when I died, it was because I didn't see one of those little tiny gray projectiles, and I got hit. Though you can also die from other things, like by touching some of the higher mountain ranges and so on. There's a total of 8 levels, not including the final boss. However, one thing that you might quickly realize is that some of these levels have the exact same layout. And maybe this was just due to lack of memory, or they didn't have the time or the inclination to create like 6 distinct levels. So for example, levels 1, 4, and 8 are exactly the same layout, and then levels 3 and 6 are also the exact same layout, including the enemy placement. And I suppose that one thing that might really bug you about the game is the repetitiveness, the fact that you have to play through multiple levels more than once, and the fact that you have to do that like afterburner section over and over again, and you have to dock with the satellite every single time you complete a level. And these mini-games get relatively boring pretty quickly. I mean, I suppose that they've just like taken away the afterburner sequences and the space station, or maybe only make you like go into the space station once, and after that you can like automatically dock. It might not seem so repetitive, and it might not be a bad game. And while in some ways this is not really a bad game, I mean, it technically looks kind of cool with the fake 3D landscapes. It just feels like it probably needed a bit more time and polish put into this, at least in terms of making it an enjoyable game, rather than one that simply looks graphically impressive. Alright, it's our final US game for the month of June, and this is SNK's Mechanized Attack. Seems like we've seen a large number of arcade shooting games recently, and Mechanized Attack is yet another one of those. This is a pretty basic light gun shooter. This is certainly not a beautiful game, and we have these weird little round satellites or something that shoot at you, and then you also have some generic guys popping up from below. You'll come across some ships with these gun ports. Not really a whole lot we haven't seen before. This was originally released in arcades in 1989. The cabinet came with 2 mounted guns. And while the arcade game looks slightly better than the NES version, it's still not exactly anything to write home about. I don't know that this was a huge success in the arcades. At the end of the first level, you'll have a boss helicopter, and then you go on to stage 2, which is where you actually land on this island. You then go through a little jungle thing. Again, there's soldiers shooting at you, nothing too exciting. Oh yeah, and some of the enemies, when you shoot them, it'll turn out they're like some kind of like Terminator-style robots, and they'll lose their human disguise. And there's some kind of annoying stuff here, like when going through the jungle, suddenly everything will turn completely dark except for the gun flashes. Obviously, it's pretty easy to get hit during these scenes. One thing I do love, though, is this absolutely amazing screen when you die. There's a train level that ends with a gigantic tank that shoots at you. That little white target that goes up and down, that's what you have to shoot at to defeat him. Then he just sort of transforms into an ambulatory robot. Really nothing too surprising here. One thing that Mechanized Attack does give you is a couple of branching paths that you get to choose which way you want to go through. It's almost kind of hard to talk about this game simply because, there's really not a lot to it. It's a bog standard shooting game, and that's really about it. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so you shoot some planes for a while, then there's more jungle. Sometimes in the jungle level everything will go dark again, meaning that you can't see the enemies. There's a cave level, sewer level, you got the old underground military base level. One interesting thing about this game is that it has a debug mode, which can be accessed from the main menu. This will show you a sprite of a young woman. And here's where things get interesting. By pressing the correct buttons, you can actually cause her clothes to disappear. There's multiple stages of this. It will take you down to where she's just showing her underwear. And if anyone out there is under the age of 18, I implore you, please close your eyes during this segment. This is for mature audiences only. So finally you can remove her unmentionables, and then kind of get to see the whole Monty, so to speak. Yeah, so if you're wondering what a naked woman actually looked like up close, this is it, baby. I hope some of you have come away from this with a little bit of education. Finally, you get to the last level and you fight a boss who's one of those basic, brain in the jar type enemies. You gotta shoot the little targets, avoid his various missiles and whatnot. It's kind of a long boss fight. Once you eventually manage to break through the boss's incredibly bulletproof glass jar, he'll blow up and the game is over. Looks like you escape in a helicopter somehow. And somehow you have returned peace to the free world by shooting up a bunch of robot dogs and a brain in the jar. I'm not even really sure what the brain in the jar was up to. Regardless, this is very low tier SNK. I've never even heard of this game until I played it for Chrontendo, and I suspect that many of you will have never heard of it either. I promised you another game from Alexei Pajitnov, and I have now delivered. This is Hatris, one of the rather odd sequels that Pajitnov released in the wake of Tetris. Love the little title screen of Alexei running around carrying hats. The game gives you a few options, for example, choosing the stage and whether or not you want music. Now, as you know, the original Tetris game involved falling blocks. Hatris is a rather bizarre variation on this, and by bizarre, I mean that it literally has you stacking up piles of hats. I suppose the plot here, as it is, involves you running a rather strangely mechanized hat retailer, and the object is to stack up the hats to make them disappear. Presumably, the reason they disappear is because someone came in and bought a big stack of hats. I'm not really sure what is actually going on here, but you can make money, as you can see on the right-hand side. You actually make money when a row of hats gets cleared. And in terms of how the game works, well, that's pretty much it. Now, the main difference between this and Tetris is you don't just have like a single block coming down at you at one time. You actually have two hats falling at once. I suppose that if there was only one hat involved, the game would be incredibly easy. So the best case scenario for you is that the two hats that are coming down will just happen to match up to a pair of hats that you have on the ground. While they're coming down, you can reverse the placement of the hats so that you can sort of flip them using the D-pad. And if one stack of hats is much higher than the other stack of hats next to it, you can often place one on the higher row and then using the D-pad, left or right, moving the second hat to a different stack. Hatris didn't get released in the US until 1992. As you can see, this has the much cooler Roger Dean logo. So the basic idea of the US version is exactly the same. However, the game does have new graphics and music. New levels will introduce different types of hats, as well as different hat head models. Here they look kind of like Frankenstein. Now, as you can imagine, one factor involved here is the fact that the length of those top hats are pretty damn tall, and they can stack up a lot faster than, say, the baseball caps. What you don't want to do is have the hats stack up so high that they reach the top of the screen, because then you'll get a game over. There is a certain amount of luck involved in this. If you get a couple bad hat selections, it can really mess up the game. And one other unusual thing here is that you can actually call on Alexei himself or his little friend to move the hats around a little bit. This will cost you money, the money that you make when you sell the hats. You will have to pay him to do this, but it will allow you to move one stack of hats over to a different stack. Now, there was also, around the same time, an arcade version. I'm not really sure which one is the quote-unquote original version, but I suspect it's the Famicom game. The arcade version seems just a little generic compared to the home version. Oh, and of course there was also a version of Hatris for the Game Boy as well. As I mentioned, the arcade version looks just a little dull. It doesn't have those cute little things like Frankenstein heads or the little helper dudes. So I assume that bulletproof software was probably involved in the arcade version to a much lesser degree. Is Hatris a good game nowadays? Honestly, I'm not too sure. I mean, it's weird. It's not going to give Tetris a run for its money in terms of overall popularity. I don't think it has that sort of certain something that made Tetris such a popular game. I suppose at worst this would consider to be just a somewhat obscure cousin to Tetris. Alright, we have yet another Tetris clone, and this one is named Palamedes. Published by our old friends Hot B, and apparently developed by Natsumi. I'm not really sure how much input that they had on this project, but regardless, this is definitely not one of their finest moments. So the idea here is basically Tetris, except with dice, and instead of falling blocks, you are attempting to match up pairs of dice. Now, before we go any further, I think we need to go back and take a look at this rather hideous box art. It depicts this utterly cretinous guy who is just sort of painted in grotesque detail with this utterly repellent smile on his face as these little dice creatures dance on his head. And they went through like the detail of putting on gloves and some kind of like dice outfit that covers their body. But yet they are completely unnecessarily barefoot as they dance around on this guy's head. I'm utterly baffled why they came up with this particular idea for the box art. Now, if you're wondering why this game is called Palamedes, that is because he was a mythological figure in ancient Greece, and he's supposedly the guy who invented dice. Of course, he's done other interesting things as well. There's a famous story that when Odysseus was requested to report for the Trojan War, he pretended to be insane so he didn't have to go. Palamedes was the guy who was sent to collect Odysseus, and he believed that Odysseus was probably faking it, so he grabbed Odysseus' son and went out to the field where Odysseus was plowing and threw the kid in front of the plow. Of course, rather than running over his own son with the plow, he stopped and thus had to give up his charade of being insane. The screen layout is just kind of like Tetris turned on its head. Instead of the Tetris blocks coming down, we have dice that you sort of shoot upwards from the bottom of the screen. Now, how exactly this works is that one button rotates the die so that you can choose the number that you want when you throw it. So for example, if the die that you have just happens to show 2 on it, you then throw it up in the air, and if it hits a die that also happens to be 2, those 2 dice will disappear from the top screen, and then reappear at the bottom. As I mentioned, you can rotate the dice, so if you see several dice of a certain color lined up, you can then rotate your die to match that particular color and then shoot it. Now, aside from dies at the top of the screen disappearing when you hit them with a die of the same color, if you do manage to line up a certain number of dies in a row, it will cause one of the rows at the top to disappear. Depending how good you do with sort of your combos, you can cause several rows to disappear at once. It's a bit difficult to describe it in words, but if you sort of watch this, you'll see exactly what's happening. You just need to be constantly throwing up dice and trying to get as many combos as you can. Now, this is not really a bad game by any means, but it was by no means anywhere near as addictive as Tetris. I guess the main thing about this is there was like really only ever one Tetris. All these Tetris clones and Tetris likes were popular enough for a little while that you would actually see these types of games turn up in actual video arcades. Just like Hatris, there was an arcade version of this. I I think perhaps the whole mechanic of having to sort of constantly change the faces of the die feels a little clunky compared to rotating the blocks in Tetris. You're always trying to rotate the die to get the correct number as quickly as possible, but it's very easy to miss it and then sort of have to go back and try again to get the correct number. All in all, it's just simply one of the very many Tetris clones of the early 90s, and incidentally, in the next episode of Chrontendo, we will be seeing perhaps the most successful of all Tetris clones, and I suspect that quite a few of you know what I'm referring to. Okay, we're now done with the puzzle games, and it's time to look at some rather bad action games. So here we have Hiryu no Ken 3. Now, be aware that even though this is a side-scrolling action game, this Ken has nothing to do with the other Ken. You know, the "you are already dead" guy from the Fist of the North Star. So no, this is a completely different guy named Ken. I'm sure that absolutely none of you will remember this, but this is actually the third game in this series, and we covered the other two in earlier episodes of Chrontendo. And even I myself actually had to look these things up because I have no recollection of ever playing them. Now, the first game was released in 1985. In the US, it came out under the name of Shanghai Kid, and it's a pretty generic-looking arcade fighting game, with one exception. The game sort of gives you hints as to where to hit your opponent. A little circle will appear, and that means you can do damage to him if you hit him in that particular area. And this is actually the same mechanic used in today's game. The first game never got a console release, but the second, Flying Dragon, The Secret Scroll, hit the US in 1987. Now, this might seem a little bit familiar to some of you simply because of the game's just overwhelming awfulness as a beat-em-up. It just throws a constant stream of low-powered guys to come and attack you. It definitely has the sort of feel like you would expect from kind of like a mid-tier, mid to late early console game. Now, in 1988 we had another Famicom game, number 3 in the series, and this one was not released in the US, so we really dodged a bullet there. This one is a bit more involved. They throw in a little bit of RPG elements. I mean, it's still a pretty terrible beat 'em up, but this one is more in the style of 1988 rather than 1985. So just like the arcade game, this begins with a little tutorial about how to use those little targets when fighting your enemy. Essentially, when you see that little flashing circle on your opponent, you need to press the correct D-pad and button to connect with that area. Those flashing targets can appear in the head or also on the lower body. Same thing with you. When you see part of your own body flashing, that means that the guy's going to hit you right there and you need to block that attack. Now, of course, after you've done the tutorial, you can't just wander around and start beating people up. Nope, you actually have to prove that you fully digested the fighting mechanic. So you start off going to a tournament of some sort where you have to defeat this dude. If you lose, well then guess what? You're going all the way back to the tutorial and then you can try the tournament again. Once you get the hang of it, this guy should be pretty easy to take down. So pretty much the levels here consist of walking from left to right while being attacked by a constant stream of identical adversaries. In most cases you can simply take care of them with just a couple kicks. Every so often you'll come across a mid-level boss dude like this guy, and you often have to go through that same procedure of hitting his weak spots while guarding your own. This is how you handle most of the bosses. After this you'll eventually come across some more types of enemies and eventually a slightly harder boss. In addition to the standard fighting system of this game, this guy will occasionally do like a flying leg kick that looks a little bit silly, but he'll just sort of like fly around the room a couple times. It's pretty easy to dodge his attacks, so you can just sort of keep hitting him a few times and eventually he'll go down. And then of course we go on to more waves of generic enemies. And there are some items that you can get in this game, like there's like a health refill, that kind of thing. And after a while your kick will be kind of like powered up so that you can shoot projectiles out of it. But for the most part, this is an extremely repetitive and rather dull beat 'em up. And if you're wondering if we're going to encounter any more of these games in future Chrontendo episodes, the answer is yes, of course. I mean, I guess someone must have liked these things because they kept making them. Though I'd say if you were to sit down nowadays and try to play this on your own, you'd probably find it just way too clunky and repetitive. Alright, we're going to end this episode on a rather sour note. SD Hero Soukessen. Now, if you might recall, a few episodes ago, we discussed a little game called SD Battle Ozumo. And I pointed out that this was the first game in an absurdly long series of games involving quote-unquote super deformed robots. I mentioned that we would be seeing more of these games, and buddy, I've got some bad news for you. That day has now arrived. Rightly or wrongly, there is actually an English translation of this. Alright, so you have all these so-called super deformed robots that you can choose from. And when I say deformed, I don't mean like they have an extra ear or something. They're just all really short. Though I suppose that you would normally not consider lack of height being a deformity, per se. Now, I neither know nor care who any of these guys are. I guess there are some sort of recognizable individuals like Ultraman and that kind of stuff. I guess, I don't know, Gundam dudes. But you gotta choose a guy to rescue your girlfriend or whoever this lady is. I'm not gonna do any research on this, by the way. And then you choose to go to one of the 8 planets. You can actually do these in any order. And then once you're on the planet, there's like a very basic side-scrolling beat-em-up thing, I guess. You can get various weapon drops that'll actually change you into one of the other characters, apparently. Basically, you're just walking from left to right, shooting dudes until you get to the boss at the end. Now, one kinda cool thing is that when you do die, it gives you this rather fetishistic game over screen where your robot girlfriend is kinda like tied up on a weird robot crucifix. I'm not really sure what this is about. This actually reminds me a little bit of Hiryu 3, except maybe a bit more annoying. There's really a lot of situations where you'll get hit simply because of the enemy placement, and the whole thing seems to be kind of set up in a way that it's not very fair. Like when you jump from one screen down to the next, you might land in a spot where you'll get hit by a projectile that you simply cannot avoid. I think the best strategy for this might simply be to sort of dash through the levels as quickly as possible rather than trying to actually engage with the enemy. The bosses are, of course, a source of huge frustration, as a lot of them move extremely quickly and it's virtually impossible to dodge their attacks. I'm not exactly going to say that this is the worst game this episode, but it's almost certainly the most inconsequential, and you can completely ignore this forever. Alright, so that takes care of episode 63. Okay, so best and worst games this episode? Well, for the worst game, that's pretty obvious. The Last Starfighter. One of the biggest rip-offs that we've seen in the NES library so far. Can't really remember the last time I hated a game this much. And best game? Boy, not really a whole lot to choose from. Maybe Hatris? I guess it's kind of a low bar to set, but at least it's not awful. Next time, we'll be seeing some more games from the month of July, both from the US and from Japan. I'm sort of mixing it up a little bit so we don't have one episode completely of Japanese games and one completely of US games. Next episode will have a very well-known and beloved game, as well as a bunch of other stuff you've probably never heard of, or if you are familiar with some of the other games that we'll be looking at, you will have probably hated them. And in episode 65, we will finally make our way onto August. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.